Chapter 3 Karma Yoga, the Yoga of Action. Verse 1. Arjuna said, O Janardana, O Keshava, if it is your opinion that wisdom is better than action, then why do you wish to engage me in such violent activities? Verse 2. Your words seem to be contradictory, and my mind is now confused. Therefore, kindly tell me which particular path is most beneficial for me. Verse 3. Bhagavan Sri Kṛṣna said, O faultless one, previously I explained the two paths found in this world, the path of wisdom for the empirical philosophers, and the path of action for those that must perform action. Verse 4. A man cannot attain the state of divine consciousness free from material action simply by abstaining from action. Neither can perfection be attained simply by renunciation. Verse 5. One cannot abstain from activities, even for a moment. Indeed, all living beings are forced to engage in activities due to the influence of the modes of material nature. Anuvrtti. The purpose of Bhagavad-gītā is to elevate one beyond the bodily concept of life to the plane of consciousness or understanding the nature of the self. Sri Kṛṣna has already established this in the second chapter, but it appears that Arjuna finds some contradiction in what Kṛṣna has said. Arjuna asks Kṛṣna to further explain wisdom and action so that he may follow the proper path. This confusion is common amongst novices. Should one be a philosopher who is indifferent to the affairs of the material world, or should one engage in one's prescribed duties? What is ultimately to be understood by Kṛṣna's instructions is that both wisdom and proper engagement are interdependent. One is not complete without the other. Engagement, sometimes seen as spiritual practices without philosophy, is merely sentiment, and philosophy without practice is mental speculation. Religious practices without a solid philosophical basis often lead to fanaticism that results in destruction and death. Our modern world is all too aware of this. The interdependent relationship between philosophy and spiritual practice is indispensable for one who wants to achieve the perfection of human life. Actions should be performed with proper knowledge. Only then does one achieve the proper result and is considered a true yogi. Verse 6. One who controls the external senses, yet mentally dwells upon the sense objects, is said to be foolish and hypocritical. Verse 7. However, that person who controls the senses with the mind and engages them in karma yoga, the path of selfless action, without attachment, is superior, O Arjuna. Verse 8. You should perform your prescribed duties, since action is better than inaction. You cannot maintain your existence without action. Verse 9. All activities are meant for sacrifice, yajna, to Vishnu. Other than that, all other activities bind one to this material world. O son of Kunti, work for him alone and be free from any attachment. Anuvrtti. The Vedic injunctions enjoin that all activities should be performed as an offering to Vishnu or Kṛṣṇa. Yajño vai Vishnuhu. No embodied being can give up action even for a moment, because in the material world everyone is forced to act under the influence of the modes of nature. It is also said that the pure nature of the Atma is to be engaged in the spiritual activities of serving the Supreme Being, Kṛṣna. Therefore, all activities are to be connected to and for the satisfaction of Vishnu or Kṛṣna. This is known as the constitutional position of the Atma. It is clear from the above verses that action is better than inaction. As it is said, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. If the senses are idle and one tries to empty the mind, then what usually transpires is that the mind becomes engaged in unproductive thoughts, and eventually the sense objects carry the mind and senses away. The influence of the modes of nature over the Atma is called Maya, or illusion. This Maya is the external energy of the Absolute Truth. When the Atma is separated or disconnected from the Absolute Truth by improper philosophical understanding or improper activities, the result is bewilderment, confusion, and samsara. Verse 10. In the beginning of creation, Brahma created mankind along with the system of sacrifice, and said, "Through this sacrifice may you prosper, may it fulfill all your desires." Verse 11. The demigods, being satisfied with sacrifices, will also satisfy you. By mutually pleasing each other, you will attain the highest benefit. Verse 12. Being satisfied by your performance of sacrifices, the demigods will bestow unto you all the necessities of life. But one who enjoys these gifts without offering them to the demigods is a thief. Verse 13. Enlightened individuals are liberated from all types of impiety by accepting the remnants of foodstuffs offered in sacrifice. However, those who only cook for themselves perpetuate their own bondage. Verse 14. All living beings subsist on food, and food is produced by rain. Rain is produced due to the performance of sacrifice, and sacrifice is born of prescribed activities. Anuvrtti. In verse 10, Brahma is mentioned as the creator. According to the Vedas, Brahma is the first living being in this universe, and is manifest directly by Vishnu. Brahma's function is as the secondary creator of the planetary systems. In modern times, some atheistic thinkers, such as Professor Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist from Oxford University, have conceded that aliens from another planet may have possibly seeded life on Earth. Far-fetched as this may sound to some of us, the idea does come very close to the truth. The ancient texts of India state that Brahma resides in the highest realm in the universe, known as Satyaloka. Some of the offspring of Brahma, known as the Prajapatis, are then sent forth to seed life throughout the cosmos. But rather than look at Brahma as an alien, the Vedic texts describe him as the father of all living beings in the material world. Since Western civilization first came into contact with the pantheon of Vedic demigods, there has always been the speculation that the Vedic people, often referred to as Hindus, were pagans. Pagan meaning the worshippers of many gods and not one supreme god. Thus, Western observers concluded that monotheism, the worship or reverence of one supreme god, originated with the Abrahamic religions of the West. This, however, is not a fact. The Vedic pantheon does indeed include many lesser demigods, but the Vedic texts are quite clear that there is only one supreme being or superconsciousness that is above all. That is always referred to as Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, Vishnu, or Kṛṣṇa. For example, the Rig Veda states as follows: Tadvishno paramam padam sada pashyanti suraya diviva chakshuratatam. Translation: The divine feet of Vishnu are above all, like the sun above our heads. His holy feet are like the vigilant eye of the grand guardian over our heads like the sun. Srimad Bhagavatam says, Ete chamsa kalapumsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. Translation: The various avatars are either plenary expansions or parts of plenary expansions, but Sri Kṛṣṇa is the original source of all these avatars. Historically speaking, it is erroneous to assume that monotheism was developed by Abrahamic civilizations, independent of any outside influence. In fact, the Abrahamic religions borrowed the idea of monotheism from the Persians after King Cyrus subjugated Babylon and Judea around 500 BCE. Prior to the arrival of the Persians and continuing into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Judaism and Christianity were known to have belief systems based on one or more gods. Thus, monotheism only gradually developed among the Abrahamic religions. Since the monotheistic concept found in the Vedas is much older than the Abrahamic religions, it is only logical to conclude that the latter borrowed their thinking from the former. During the interim, the Persians, under the influence of Zoroaster, took the monotheistic philosophy from India and then transmitted it to the Middle Eastern civilizations. Indeed, monotheism has always been the central theme of India's Vedic literature. However, failing to look deeply into the philosophy of the Vedas, or possibly being culturally intimidated by the superiority of Vedic knowledge as opposed to Western philosophies and religions, Eurocentric academics and fundamental religionists have marginalized the ancient Vedic civilization of India. The German scholar Max Müller propagated further misinformation on this subject in the 19th century with the invention of the Aryan invasion theory, stating that Vedic civilization did not originate in India. Yet all this is quite far from the truth. According to Müller, the Aryans were a nomadic tribe from Europe who invaded India. Yet there is no evidence that the Aryans were nomads. In fact, to suggest that a nomadic tribe of barbarians wrote literature of such profound wisdom as the Vedas defies imagination. Furthermore, within the Vedas, there is no mention whatsoever of an original homeland, and archaeologically, there is a complete lack of evidence to prove an invasion ever occurred. It can only be concluded that the Aryan people and Vedic knowledge were always indigenous to India. The Vedic knowledge is that Vishnu or Kṛṣṇa is supreme, and the lesser gods and goddesses such as Brahma, Shiva, Ganesh, Kartikeya, Kali, and Saraswati, etc., are actually servants of the Supreme Being and are empowered with the duties of managing the universal affairs of material nature. In the above verses, Sri Kṛṣna recommends that offerings should be made to the demigods, and thus the demigods will be pleased to bestow unto humanity all the necessities of life. This is, in short, a universal law of taxation. In other words, we must give the demigods their dues. It is also intrinsic to the nature of the Atma to perform service and sacrifice. Constitutionally, the Atma, being part of the organic whole, the absolute truth, is duty-bound to serve the whole, both in this life and in eternity. When sacrifice or offerings are made to Vishnu, such as fruits, vegetables, etc., then one's senses become purified by eating the remnants of such offerings. But if one takes the things of this world without first acknowledging to whom they actually belong, then one simply incurs a karmic reaction. This also includes our daily food, that should first be offered to Vishnu or Kṛṣṇa. It will be explained by Sri Kṛṣna later in Bhagavad-gītā that these food offerings should comprise of vegetables, fruits, milk products, flowers, etc. Non-vegetarian food items cannot be offered to Vishnu or Kṛṣṇa. Consequently, the servants of Vishnu or Kṛṣṇa are vegetarian. Kṛṣna will also explain that those who serve the absolute truth are not duty-bound to serve the demigods, nor are they bound by any other social consideration. Verse 15. One should know that prescribed activities originate from the Vedas, and the Vedas originate from the imperishable absolute truth. Thus, the omnipresent absolute truth is eternally present within the acts of sacrifice. Verse 16. O Partha, one who lives in this world but does not accept the Vedic system, lives an impious life in pursuit of sense pleasure. Thus he lives his life in vain. Verse 17. However, for one who finds pleasure in the self, there is no duty to fulfill. He rejoices in the self and internally is completely self-satisfied. Verse 18. In this world he neither gains by action nor gains by inaction, neither does he depend upon any other person. Verse 19. Therefore continue to perform your prescribed duties perfectly, without attachment to the results. By acting without attachment, one attains the absolute. Verse 20. In the past, kings such as Janaka and others attained perfection by performing their prescribed duties. In order to set a proper example to the people in general, you should also act appropriately. Verse 21. However a great man conducts himself, common men will follow. Accordingly, whatever standard he sets by his actions, others will follow in his footsteps. Anuvrtti. The Vedic system of political and spiritual leadership is that one should lead by example. Unfortunately, in today's world, good leaders of any kind are hard to come by. Not only are we disappointed to learn that those we have elected to public office are often pilfering the wealth of the country for their own benefit, but we are even more shocked to learn that so many of our so-called spiritual leaders cannot even maintain the most basic principles of morality and engage in abominable, depraved practices. Sri Kṛṣna states in the above verse that what a great man does, the common man will follow. This is most evident when we observe how movie stars, rock stars, and sports personalities influence the majority of people today. That we tend to be influenced by others is a human characteristic. Therefore, role models are essential. But what human society needs are role models that are knowledgeable, cultured, morally principled, and spiritually advanced. Verse 22. O Arjuna, son of Pritha, I have no duty to perform whatsoever in the three worlds. I lack nothing, nor do I need to gain anything. Yet I still engage in activities. Verse 23. If I avoid activity, then all men will follow my path and neglect their prescribed duties, O Partha. Verse 24. If I do not act properly, then the general populace will be ruined, and I will be the cause of unwanted progeny. In this way, I will cause the destruction of all beings. Verse 25. O descendant of Bharat, just as the ignorant are attached to their activities, similarly, the wise must also work, but without attachment, for the welfare of all. Verse 26. The wise should not disturb the minds of the ignorant, who are attached to their selfish activities. Rather, remaining unattached and fully executing their duties, they should encourage the ignorant and engage them in pious activities. Verse 27. All activities are performed by the modes of nature. But those who are deluded by the false identification of the body think, I am the doer. Anuvrtti. Sri Kṛṣna states in the above verses that he has no duty to perform, that he lacks nothing, nor has he anything to gain. In other words, Kṛṣna is already perfect and complete. Om Purnam. Yet Kṛṣna acts, he is not idle. He acts for the benefit of humanity, by establishing spiritual practices in every age. Dharmam tu sakshat bhagavad pranitam. When an avatar of the Absolute Truth makes his appearance in the material world, he does so to establish eternal principles of Dharma. Kṛṣna appeared at the end of Dwapara Yuga, 5,237 years ago, 3,228 BCE, and spoke the Bhagavad-gītā. However, this was not Kṛṣna's most recent appearance. Kṛṣna appeared again after the beginning of Kali Yuga, 525 years ago. This Kali Yuga avatar of Kṛṣna is known as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. In his avatar as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Kṛṣna taught the process of Sankirtana, the congregational chanting of the Maha Mantra, to accompany the study of Bhagavad-gītā. As regards the Maha Mantra, the Kali Santarana Upanishad states as follows. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Iti Shodhashakam Nam Kali Kalmasha Nashanam. Nata Paratharopaya Sarvavedeshu Drishyate. Translation. The 16 words of this Maha Mantra are specifically meant for counteracting the contamination of Kali Yuga. There is no other way but to chant these names of Kṛṣna. After searching throughout the Vedic literature, one will not find a process for this age that is more sublime. The transcendental potency of the Maha Mantra is further described as follows in the Padma Purana. Nama Chintamani Krishnash Chaitanya Rasa Vigraha Purna Shudho Nityamukto Binatvan Nama Namino. Translation. The name of Sri Kṛṣna is a transcendental touchstone, full of all transcendental mellows, complete, pure, and eternally liberating. The name of Kṛṣna is none different than Kṛṣna. The study of the Bhagavad-gītā and the practice of Sankirtana have now spread all over the world. It is no longer something that is only available in India. There will be more discussion on this particular topic in chapter 4, verse 8. The proper mode of action and the proprietor of the results of action is only understood when one is free from the identification of the self as the body, as being a byproduct of the body, or that one is the doer of activities. We walk, we talk, we digest food, we construct buildings, and even empires. But all these activities are made possible for us by a combination of material nature and the Paramatma, the superconsciousness that pervades the entire universe. How all this transpires is inconceivable to those under the bodily conception of life. Thus, the idea that I am this body, arising from false ego, must be abandoned. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Is there life after death? The answers to all these questions begin to fall into place when one gives up the concept of the body as the self. Many great thinkers from Western civilization have struggled with the ultimate questions of life and death, but failed to find the answers or the solutions to the problems. This in part was due to the fact that they contemplated life under the false premise that the body is the self. Self-realization and realization of the absolute truth begins with the abandonment of the bodily concept of life. Verse 28. Yet, O mighty armed one who is a knower of the truth concerning action and the modes of material nature, understands that it is the modes interacting with one another, and thus he remains unattached. Verse 29. Those bewildered by the modes of material nature are engrossed in material activities conducted by those modes. The wise should not disturb the ignorant who are bereft of proper knowledge. Verse 30. Completely surrendering all your activities unto me, with your consciousness fully situated in the self, without any selfish motivation, without any sense of ownership, and without grief, fight. Verse 31. Those that faithfully follow these instructions of mine, without envy, will become free from the bondage of actions. Verse 32. However, you should know that those persons who out of envy do not follow my instructions are deprived of all knowledge. They have lost sight of the goal of life and are bereft of intelligence. Verse 33. Even a wise man acts according to his nature. All living beings act according to their natures, for what can repression achieve? Verse 34. The senses are attracted to and repelled by the objects of the senses, but one must not become controlled by such attraction or aversion, for they are obstacles. Verse 35. It is better to perform one's own prescribed duties imperfectly, rather than perform another's duties perfectly. It is better to die while performing one's own duties, for executing the duties of another is fraught with uncertainty. Anuvrtti. The faults of material life are many. Herein, Sri Kṛṣna has mentioned certain faults that a serious student of the Bhagavad-gītā should be preeminently aware of. Ignorance, foolishness, selfish motivation, a false sense of proprietorship, as well as attraction and aversion to the sense objects, are mentioned by Kṛṣna. But more dangerous than any other fault is envy. Envy, it seems, is purely evil, as Kṛṣna says that those who do not follow the teachings of the Bhagavad-gītā out of enviousness are bereft of all knowledge and intelligence. Another danger is the tendency of neglecting one's own duty and trying to perform the duty of another. In other words, Kṛṣna tells Arjuna to tend to his own business. Arjuna is a Kshatriya, and his duty, as already discussed, is to protect and defend the kingdom. Arjuna, however, is showing leanings towards renunciation, becoming a monk, a sannyasi. Arjuna wants to abandon his duty and perform that of another. But Kṛṣna warns him that this is not a good idea. In fact, Kṛṣna says it is even dangerous. Kṛṣna explains that it is better to perform one's own duty imperfectly than perform another's duty perfectly. In particular, Kṛṣna is encouraging Arjuna to follow the codes of conduct set down for Kshatriyas, of which abandoning the battlefield for a warrior is not an option. Verse 36. Arjuna asked, "O Kṛṣna, descendant of the Vrishnis, what is it that makes a man perform impious activities, even against his will, as if by force?" Verse 37. Bhagavan Sri Kṛṣna said, "It is lust which transforms into anger, that is manifest from the mode of passion. Know this lust to be totally insatiable and extremely evil. It is the great enemy of this world." Verse 38. As a fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, and as the womb covers an embryo, similarly, lust covers the consciousness of the living being. Verse 39. O Kaunteya, the discrimination of even a wise man can become covered by this eternal nemesis in the form of lust, that is like an all-devouring fire. Verse 40. It is said that the senses, mind, and intelligence are the sitting places of this enemy. Covering one's knowledge, it bewilders the embodied living being. Verse 41. Therefore, O noblest amongst the Bharatas, you must first bring the senses under control and eliminate lust, which is the embodiment of all impiety and the destroyer of knowledge and realization. Verse 42. It is said by the wise that the senses are superior to the sense objects, the mind is superior to the senses, and the intelligence is superior to the mind. Superior to the intelligence is the individual unit of consciousness. Verse 43. O mighty-armed Arjuna, knowing the individual unit of consciousness to be superior to the intelligence, steady the mind with the pure intellect of the self, and conquer this indomitable enemy in the form of lust. Anuvrtti. Herein it is stated that the mind is superior to the senses, and intelligence is superior to the mind. But above the intelligence is the consciousness, or Atma. The material body is comprised of the mind, senses, and intelligence, and they are therefore considered as material elements. In chapter 7, verse 4 of Bhagavad-gītā, Sri Kṛṣna lists the 8 material elements as earth, water, fire, air, space, mind, intelligence, and false ego. Then, in the next verse, Kṛṣna describes a superior energy known as Jiva Bhuta, the units of individual consciousness. Kṛṣna says that this Jiva Bhuta, also known as Atma, is categorically different than the material elements. It is fully spiritual. But when lust, the all-devouring enemy of self-realization, covers the mind, senses, and intelligence of the superior Jiva Bhuta, then the knowledge and realization of the Jiva Bhuta are destroyed. And therefore Kṛṣna says that first the yogi must conquer lust. If one does not pursue the cravings of lust, and instead takes control of one's lower self with one's higher self, lust will eventually be vanquished. However, if one tries to satisfy his burning lust, then it is like pouring fuel onto a fire. Om Tat Sat. Thus ends chapter 3, entitled Karma Yoga, from the conversation between Sri Kṛṣna and Arjuna in the Upanishad known as Srimad Bhagavad-gītā, the Yoga Shastra of divine knowledge, from the Bhishma Parva of Mahabharata, the literature revealed by Vyas in 100,000 verses.